Oh my god, this whole time I've been muted, so you never actually heard anything. I'm stupid. Okay, hello everybody, Super Brainsy. Welcome to day 45 of Workout Grind. As you guys know, my grandma passed away last week, and I decided to go back to the Philippines tonight. I booked my tickets, that's what I've been processing this whole time. And now I'm ready to ball. Okay, I'm ready to bounce. So yeah, I'm just gonna set up this whole thing, and we're gonna, grind. We're gonna grind. Go. Let's go, man. Let's do this.
This video is sponsored by the book summary app, Blinkist. Discover, learn from, and refresh yourself on the world's best books. Use the link in the description and you'll receive a 7-day free trial and 40% off Blinkist Premium membership. George Orwell is perhaps one of the most widely read and referenced literary figures of all time, certainly of the 20th century. Cited and mentioned by nearly every contemporary ideology and political worldview, his voice echoes down the halls of history. His insights about the power of language and technology, as well as his warnings about the manipulation of truth and the threat of totalitarianism, being relevant to rooms on both sides of the hall, left and right, transcend the walls of any one moment, movement, or ideology. Orwell was born in 1903 in Bengal, India, which, at the time, was part of the British Empire. He was born with the name Eric Arthur Blair and would only become George Orwell many years later when using the name as a pseudonym to protect his family and their reputation as well as his own. As a child, Orwell's socioeconomic conditions were unusual. His mother, being the daughter of a wealthy man, had the attitude and tastes of someone well off. But by the time Orwell was born, his family had little money and his father was working as a civil servant. Orwell would later refer to his upbringing as lower upper middle class, a sort of amalgamation of impoverishment and snobbery. After his family returned from India to England, where they were originally from, with the help of some family connections, Orwell was sent to an English preparatory school. Here, both his unusual temperament and his brilliance became apparent, receiving both ridicule from other students, as well as scholarships to England's leading schools, Wellington and Eton. At an early age, however, Orwell found the academic environment miserable, and so he would never go on to university. Instead, in 1922, he entered the British Imperial Service and worked as a colonial police officer. He was posted in Burma, a province of British India at the time. He also found this experience miserable and conflicting with his values. 5 years later, he would resign. Over the subsequent few years, Orwell would work several low-paying service jobs throughout Paris and London, including a part-time assistant job in a second-hand bookshop. Around this time, he would also begin writing and publishing books of his own, including Burmese Days, A Clergyman's Daughter, and Keep the Expedition Flying.
Yeah, ay, wala,
Surely
nakayo
influenced by
kay
his
wala na
unique
emails.
upbringing and his diverse experiences across
Oh.
Burma, France, and London,
What?
Orwell would develop a fondness for what he referred to as ordinary people and ordinary life. Individuals who worked normal jobs, were not obsessed with material goods, had minimal education, and didn't strive for nor achieve any sort of prominence, power, or so-called greatness. In contrast, he developed a disdain for intellectuals. Ironically, of course, Orwell would soon become one, perhaps one of the most prominent intellectuals of the 20th century. Orwell's rise to prominence as an intellectual and literary figure can be largely attributed to the catalyzing experiences he had after traveling to Spain in 1936. Initially, he went to Spain as a journalist to report on the Spanish Civil War, but he soon enlisted as a volunteer in the Republican militia to fight against the fascist opposition. If you had asked me why I had joined the militia, I should have answered, to fight against fascism. And if you had asked me what I was fighting for, I should have answered, common decency, Orwell later wrote. During his time in the war, Orwell was shot in the throat and nearly killed by a sniper. Perhaps even more affecting for him, however, was what he witnessed in the coverage and portrayal of the war. Years later, he wrote, "Early in life, I had noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper. But in Spain, for the first time, I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely, denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired, hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retailing these lies, and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that had never happened. I saw, in fact, history being written not in terms of what happened, but of what ought to have happened, according to various party lines." Orwell's observations revealed to him a degradation of the value placed on objective truth. Objective truth was being replaced more and more by the faith in subjective truths of ideologies and political parties. I am willing to believe that history is for the most part inaccurate and biased, but what is peculiar to our own age is the abandonment of the idea that history could be truthfully written, Orwell wrote. The consequences of this, for Orwell, risk leading to totalitarianism, a form of government in which individuals lack freedom and instead are subordinate to and controlled by the central authority of the state. When there is no belief in objective truth, truth solely exists in the human mind, becoming easily malleable and manipulatable. For Orwell, this threat looms regardless of any specific ideological and political leaning, be it left or right. It is just the common basis of agreement of truth with its implication that human beings are all one species of animal that totalitarianism destroys, he wrote. During the early and mid-20th century, these consequences were unfolding and totalitarianism was spreading in Germany, Italy, Spain, the Soviet Union, as well as, in Orwell's mind, England and beyond. In response to this, Orwell believed that literature could be used to help warn against this development. It could be used to shed light on the circumstances of the world and help people fend against the increasing threat to freedom, truth, and well-being. What I have most wanted to do throughout the past 10 years is to make political writing into an art. My starting point is always a feeling of partisanship, a sense of injustice. When I sit down to write a book, I do not say to myself, I'm going to produce a work of art. I write it because there is some lie that I want to expose, some fact to which I want to draw attention, and my initial concern is to get a hearing, Orwell wrote. Though Orwell had already written and published several relatively successful books by around the year 1939, his real rise to global mainstream prominence came after the publication of his novella, Animal Farm, in 1945. And it was here that Orwell's mission to spread important ideas and warnings about the threats of the time and future times began to successfully ensue at scale. In Animal Farm, there is no real main character. Rather, the protagonist of the book is a population of anthropomorphized animals living on a farm known as Manor Farm. Each species of animal represents a different archetype or group of humans in society. One day on the farm, a pig named Old Major expresses to the other animals that they are being exploited by the humans who own the farm, and, if they work together, the animals can and ought to overtake the humans and create a better future for themselves. A revolution happens, the animals take over, and a new philosophy known as animalism is established. Two pigs named Snowball and Napoleon take lead over the new conditions of the farm, which soon becomes just Napoleon after he has Snowball chased off. Though things appear to go well initially, hell soon breaks loose, and the pigs who lead the farm begin to lead with malice, selfishness, manipulation, and violence, ultimately becoming the equivalent of the humans that the animals had revolted against. The creatures outside look from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already, it was impossible to say which was which. Reads the final line of the book. Broadly, Animal Farm is a thinly veiled critique of the Russian Revolution and the subsequent rule of Joseph Stalin over the Soviet Union. It showcases and warns against the fallibilities and susceptibilities of revolutionary movements and the potential threats of counter-revolutions. What arguably makes this novella so unique and important, however, is its ability to cut through the surface of any single social or political target and instead reveal timeless truths about social, political, and psychological phenomena, and to do so with animals. In the form of a fable, like that of Aesop or Disney, Orwell brings the complexities of social and political movements into an accessible, easily understandable allegorical format that can appeal to mass audiences across time and space. And that's exactly what Animal Farm did and does, selling 500,000 copies within the first year of publication and then going on to sell millions and millions more. The same year Animal Farm was released, Orwell lost his wife while she was undergoing a routine surgery. Only a year or two later, he began to fall ill himself with tuberculosis. He would, however, muster everything he had left and work on one last book. After collapsing multiple times while writing, his science, speculative, and dystopian fiction novel, 1984, was released in 1949. In brief, 1984 focuses on a character named Winston Smith, who lives in what was once London but is now a province of the superstate of Oceania. Oceania is run by a totalitarian government known as the Party, which follows the doctrines of English socialism, or INCSOC, and is led by a dictator figure known as Big Brother. In Oceania, citizens are under constant surveillance and are ruthlessly punished for even so much as thinking thoughts that counter the party's ideological doctrines. Devices known as telescreens are put in everyone's homes, where they both consume broadcasted content and are constantly observed by the party. What are known as the thought police are also always looming, ready to arrest anyone who commits what are known as thought crimes, or simply thinking the wrong things about the party. Moreover, the party is constantly producing propaganda in the form of manipulated information, data, statistics, and language. Language is simplified and reduced in Oceania through what is known as newspeak, where words are eliminated from the vernacular in order to prevent the likelihood of nuanced critical thinking. Words are also often used in a contradictory manner in order to undermine the true nature of the things they describe. For example, labor camps are referred to as joy camps. Torture takes place in the Ministry of Love. The military is referred to as the Ministry of Peace. The department responsible for falsifying data and facts is known as the Ministry of Truth. And the slogans of Oceania are, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. All of this causes citizens to engage in what is known as doublethink, a sort of cognitive dissonance in which they both have their own perceptions and understanding of what is true, and yet they accept what they are being told by the party as true, despite any contradictions. At the beginning of the novel, Winston writes in his diary, "Down with Big Brother." By the end of the novel, the narrator concludes, referring to Winston, 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Like Animal Farm, 1984 would obtain immediate success, which Orwell was able to witness in his lifetime before dying of tuberculosis the next year in 1950. Ultimately, it is unclear how cynical Orwell truly was, but the cynical endings to his 2 masterworks are, arguably, not a declaration of total hopelessness, but a warning for the potential hopelessness that the future could exhibit, the future we are living in now. Since Orwell's passing, his work has only continued to become increasingly popular and culturally relevant. 1984 is likely one of the most widely read books, certainly of the dystopian speculative genre, finding itself still, 75 years later, a part of many, if not most, high school English literature classes, as well as college courses. Orwell has become one of the few writers in history to have a term created out of his work, Orwellian. Most broadly, Orwellian refers to any conditions reminiscent of Orwell's work in which the welfare and freedom of citizens are undermined or at the risk of being undermined, typically by a central political power and ideology. But, arguably, Orwellian is not purely defined by totalitarian conditions, but by the means in which totalitarian conditions are carried out. Specifically, it refers to the intentional distortion and manipulation of language and information for the purposes of serving some ulterior power for power's sake. Like Orwell's work itself, however, this term is often misunderstood, misrepresented, or altered in service to whatever cause the user favors, often causes and ideologies that Orwell himself would likely have disagreed with. The term Orwellian can apparently be Orwellian itself. What is clear and important to note, however, is that although the Party of Oceania in 1984 originated from socialism, Orwell was not a critic of socialism. He was a critic of totalitarianism, regardless of its origins or political leaning. He was, in fact, a proponent of democratic socialism, a political democracy with a socially run, decentralized economy. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it, Orwell wrote. Furthermore, he was anti-capitalist and believed capitalism incentivizes conditions of suffering and leads to small concentrations of power and wealth. This certainly makes those who reference Orwell in favor of capitalism and against socialism, especially and ironically Orwellian. Ultimately, regardless of whether you agree with Orwell or like his writing, there is no denying his influence, and there is no denying the value and relevance of exploring the topics and ideas that he did. His insights into how human psychology plays out in the arena of politics and how the use and control of language influences and controls the thoughts and opinions of a population is likely a timeless and immensely relevant insight to all societies, past, present, and future. His unique ability to use language to convey this insight and warn against the power and influence of language is something only a brilliant writer could even try to do. And his ability to bring incredibly complex and typically dry concepts down into the realm of mass appeal and interest perhaps has helped ensure that the developments of aspects of the world remain on a track that leads to, at the very least, a less dystopian destination. In truth, we are always susceptible to our own malice and ignorance when we aren't paying attention, individually and collectively. Tyranny is not a part of history, it is a part of humanity. Humanity is always on the brink of slipping into it, of chasing the rabbit of hope into dystopian wonderlands. Orwell realized this, that tyranny was always possible and can...
Oh, try again.
This video is sponsored by AG1. Start your day with foundational nutrition that supports whole body health. Use the link in the description to get your free welcome kit. It was Bertrand's first night in his new cottage in the countryside of the Scottish lowlands. He had just moved from Stockbridge, a neighborhood that was once a reasonably small village, but had become absorbed by Scotland's capital city of Edinburgh, as the new town had grown and encroached on the neighboring villages. Bertrand didn't really like people. He often found himself feeling exhausted by them, at best. He felt this way as long as he could remember. As a child, he was very rambunctious. At least that's what people called him. He was insistent, curious, and active. He often challenged local boys to fights. He refused to sit still in primary school. He liked finding high places to climb and then throwing rocks off the edge to see them explode into pieces. Being of a strict, traditional religious family, Bertrand frequently found himself in trouble and subject to the discipline of his father. His father was especially strict and harsh, and his discipline often teetered into the realm of abuse. He would sometimes hit Bertrand, or deprive him of things like food or his bed. Bertrand's mother's disciplinary style was far more passive, but being passively complicit in abuse is its own form of abuse. Outside of his home life, Bertrand's experience at school and church wasn't much better. A figure like his father seemed to be present everywhere. At an early age, for Bertrand, people were mostly just reminders that he needed to be someone else, someone who others expected and wanted him to be. As Bertrand got older, he fell more and more in line. He learned how to accept and adhere to the rules, demands, and structure of his home, his church, his school programs, and society. After secondary school, he enrolled in a shipbuilding program and then went on to work for a major ship manufacturer in the city. His boss was awful, often taking advantage of Bertrand, forcing him to work jobs without pay or fulfill tasks completely unrelated to his responsibilities. His coworkers sometimes took advantage of him as well, especially the older ones. Outside of work, he was mostly alone, as he struggled to maintain many friendships and relationships. Bertrand was often angry, at work and at home. He felt trapped in the neighborhood and city. He was regularly bothered by the noise and activity. The sounds of the world seemed to constantly bang against his home, a small one-bedroom stone-faced construction sandwiched between others just like it. Sounds smacked against his windows, his floorboards, his walls, his head. At 32 years old, Bertrand had some money, some skills, and some autonomy. And now, he wanted out. When the first opportunity came for him to leave the neighborhood and surrounding city, he took it. Now, in his new cottage home, deep in the countryside, he was secluded from everyone. It was a perfect mid-sized simple home with plenty of land where he could now build handcrafted ships directly for individuals on his own. The cottage was over 2 miles away from any towns. It was accessible only by one single road that would rarely see much of any traffic. From every angle of his house, you couldn't see anyone. You couldn't even see any signs of anyone. It was just Bertrand now. It was late and Bertrand was tired. He lay in bed, thinking back and forth to himself for a while. Soon, he closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. The hallucinogenic state of sleep began to take over his waking mind. Typical to this phase of the night, he experienced weird, disconnected thoughts, contemplations, visualizations, and desires that Bertrand didn't recognize and that he wasn't quite sure of where they came from. Suddenly, his eyes shot open. A wave of fear and anxiety crashed over him, knocking him back onto the shores of wakefulness. He could have sworn he heard what sounded like a loud thud. He frantically looked around the room trying to locate it. Not finding anything, he quickly got up and went over to one of his bedroom windows. He looked out across the sprawling grass-covered hills scattered with trees, the landscape dimly lit by only stars and the waxing crescent moon. He looked down at his front yard, then his front door. Then he looked to both sides of the cottage, pushing the sides of his head against the window to get as much perspective as he could. There was nothing. He said out loud to himself, confused. Must have been in my head, he thought to himself. Bertrand went back to bed. Again, he closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. This breath was quite a bit louder and shook a bit as he exhaled. He struggled to fall back asleep. His heart was beating a tune the opposite of a lullaby. After enough time had passed, however, the crests of brainwaves began to spread out again, and Bertrand began to fall back into the early stages of sleep. Thud, thud, thud. His eyes shot open again. Trying to be as quiet as he could, he clumsily rolled out of bed and scurried to his closet. He pulled out a long piece of wood that looked like an old piece of floorboard. Slowly, he slid on his feet over to the bedroom door and opened it. His face clenched as it creaked. Hesitantly, Bertrand made his way around the house, holding the piece of wood over his shoulders. Starting on the second floor, he checked every hall and every room. He checked behind the curtains, he checked in the closets and hidden pockets of rooms. He checked behind every door. Then he did the same on the first floor. There was nothing anywhere. Thud, Bertrand heard again. This time it was louder. He was sure it was coming from inside. It sounded like it was coming from beneath him. Thud, thud. Bertrand hadn't checked the basement yet. He slowly opened the basement door, his eyes peering timidly around the edge of it. Not seeing anything, he began down the stairs as light as he could, carrying all his weight on the fronts of his feet. As he descended, he looked around the cold, dark, barren space filled with miscellaneous items that he was storing down there. Otherwise, there was nothing. Thud, 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 he heard again. This instance was by far the loudest. As Bertrand attempted to follow the direction of the sound, his eyes caught something he hadn't previously noticed. It was a handle on what appeared to be a small wooden hatch on the ground in one of the corners of the basement. Almost without thinking, Bertrand approached it. He stared down at it. His heart was beating so loudly, he couldn't tell if the thudding sound was coming from him now or beneath him. With a shaky hand that struggled to follow the direction of his mind, Bertrand reached down and opened the door. In an instant, a plume of black smoke and fragments of light exploded out of it, knocking Bertrand back and off his feet and shattering the piece of wood into shards. When he regained some semblance of awareness and control, Bertrand found in front of him what could only be described as some sort of monster. Bertrand entered into a state of shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He didn't believe it. I must be dreaming, he thought to himself, but the pain felt undeniably real. The smoke and light were still emanating out of the open hatch, and Bertrand couldn't get a clear view. What he could see, though, appeared to be a large, shadowy creature. It just stood there, staring back at Bertrand through the clouds of smoke and beams of light. It moved with a sort of unnatural naturalness, a fluidity typically reserved only for underwater creatures. It looked like it was almost hovering. Before Bertrand could get a good view, he got up and sprinted out of the basement. He ran up the stairs, out the front door, and down the road. He ran, and he ran, and he ran. The next morning, a shopkeeper for a general store in one of the nearest towns found Bertrand sleeping outside the store's entrance. The shopkeeper was an older man in his 60s or 70s. His hair was gray and thin, mostly only left on the sides of his head, filling in more and more down toward his chin, forming into a full beard. He was short and hunched over a bit, but he walked with complete confidence and indifference. He gave Bertrand a friendly but forceful nudge with his foot as he walked up to the store's entrance. Bertrand quickly jolted up, dusting himself off, shaking his head and scrunching his eyes. "Hi," Bertrand said, frantic and disoriented. "Hello," the old man said. The man continued past Bertrand, unlocking the front door and entering the store. Bertrand chased in after him. "I need a weapon," Bertrand shouted clumsily. "Okay," said the man in a calm, unaffected tone. "Everything we have is over there." The man pointed at a few shelves and cases toward the back of the store. Bertrand rushed over to the shelves and cases and began inspecting them. "Are you from around here?" the old man asked. "Yeah, I just moved a mile or two up the road," Bertrand responded. "Why? Not much out here," said the old man. "That's why," Bertrand answered. "Self-reliance. Self-actualization." Said the old man. Bertrand compared prices of weapons and imagined battles inside his head in which he killed the monster, in which he regained control over and peace inside his home. Eventually, he looked over to the man. "I'll take that one," he said, pointing at a large sword. "That'll be 6 pounds," said the old man. Bertrand paid the shopkeeper, left the store, and made his way back home. When he arrived home, he spent some time in his front yard by himself. He practiced using the sword, trying different stances and swiping it in front of him. He struck and slashed at nothing. After many hours passed and the sun began to submit to the night sky, and he felt he was ready, Bertrand went inside and into the basement. He found the basement empty and quiet. The hatch was closed. He slowly approached it, holding the sword out in front of him. His breath sped up. His heartbeat echoed throughout his body. With the sword in his right hand, he opened the hatch with his left and outshot the smoke and light, nearly blinding him. Soon the hazy outline of the monster emerged, and Bertrand began to swing the sword back and forth in its direction. He completely forgot all the motions he had planned. The monster seemed to almost morph into what looked like a disfigured person. Bertrand swung harder and harder. The monster appeared completely unaffected. It effortlessly evaded every swing. Bertrand, soon realizing his underpreparedness, retreated, frantically running back up the stairs, out his home, and down the road. He ran, and he ran, and he ran. The next morning, again, the shopkeeper found Bertrand sleeping outside the store's entrance. He kicked Bertrand, and Bertrand jumped up. "Hi, I need a different weapon. That one didn't work. I need something more powerful and easier to use." "Okay," the old man responded. "Come on in." Bertrand followed the man in, going back over to the shelves and cases of weapons. After much inspection, he decided on a flail, a weapon with a spiked metal ball attached to a wooden handle by a metal chain. "I'll take that one," Bertrand said, pointing at the flail. "That'll be 5 pounds, the old man responded. Bertrand paid the man and began his way back home. Before going inside, he practiced with the flail. Nighttime soon began to take its turn in the sky, and after he felt ready, Bertrand made his way inside and down into the basement. Again, he found the basement quiet. The hatch was closed. Trembling, he opened it, and out shot the smoke and the light and the terror. Bertrand moved back and steadied himself, waiting for a better view of the monster. Then, he began to swing the flail recklessly. His eyes were closed more than open. The monster effortlessly shoved Bertrand away, sending him sliding on his back across the basement floor and slamming him into the wall. In immense pain now, Bertrand scurried back onto his feet and ran out of the basement, out of his home, and down the road. He ran, and he ran, and he ran. The next morning, unsurprised at this point, the shopkeeper found Bertrand waiting outside the store. He let him in, and Bertrand looked around at all the weapons again. After a few minutes passed, Bertrand looked over at the shopkeeper and said, "Excuse me." The old man looked over. "Yeah," he said. "I need weapons, but I also need something else. An edge. Something that might help me in a fight mentally, or physically, or both. Do you have anything like that?" "Yeah," the old man said nonchalantly. He walked over to the other side of the store, still behind the counter, and then returned with a small reddish bottle. "I think this is what you're looking for," he said, handing the bottle to Bertrand. The label on the bottle read, "Numbing Elixir. Feel nothing. Drink a few drops of that, and for several hours, you won't feel any pain." "That's perfect," Bertrand said with enthusiasm. "I'll take it. 1 pound, the man said. Bertrand paid the man and returned home. Before going inside, he drank a few drops of the elixir. He grabbed his flail that he had left outside and swung it around a bit as he waited for the effects of the elixir to kick in. Soon, he began to feel numb. He felt a warmth and calmness and bliss, a disconnection from his body and a disconnection from the terror. It made him so numb, however, that when he went down into the basement and opened the hatch, he could barely stand upright. His balance was off, his focus and aim were absent. He flailed even more wildly at the monster than he had the night prior. "Get out of my house," Bertrand yelled with a slur in his voice. "You don't belong here. This is mine. I live here." The monster swerved around the basement, evading Bertrand's haphazard swings. It knocked and shoved Bertrand around, but Bertrand didn't feel any of it. Because of the elixir, he didn't even barely care that he wasn't accomplishing anything. He didn't care that the monster was there, puppeteering him around his own home. Soon, Bertrand became exhausted and just gave up. He retreated back upstairs, and this night, he just slept in his room. He took a few more drops of the elixir before he went to bed. He figured if the monster was going to kill him, it would have already done so. And since he couldn't feel any pain, what was the risk? Over the following many days, Bertrand attempted to fight the monster nearly every night, drinking increasing quantities of the elixir each time. He returned to the general store many times to buy more weapons. He bought double-sided axes, stars, a bow and arrow, and so on. He bought more and more of the elixir as well. By this point, his home was a mess. He hadn't cleaned it or finished organizing his stuff, and broken objects were scattered around his home from nights in which he took too much elixir. He hadn't got much of any work done on the ship he was supposed to be working on. He couldn't focus. He couldn't barely sleep, at least not without the elixir. He couldn't live a normal life in his own home. He was angry all the time. His life became consumed by fighting the monster, doing everything he could to kill it, and yet, nothing worked. Desperate, Bertrand found himself at the store again. "I need something else, something different," he said to the shopkeeper in a defeated tone as he stared at the inventory of weapons and elixirs. "Do you have anything else?" "What exactly are you fighting?" the old man asked. "You've never even said." Bertrand looked up and over at him. "I'm not sure. It's some sort of monster. It lives in the basement of my new home." Said the old man. "Well, you've tried nearly every weapon I have, every elixir." The old man rubbed his beard for a moment. "What does the monster want?" "I'm not sure," Bertrand responded, confused. "It's a monster. I don't know if it wants anything." "Well, everything wants something. Have you tried talking to it?" Bertrand paused. "No, like I said, it's a monster." "Well, maybe you should try. You know, some monsters don't even mean to be monsters, and they don't want to be. They're born or created in a way that causes them to be one, or the world treats them like one, and that causes them to be one. Either way, they often just need what you or I or anyone else needs. To be talked to be respected, to be given the space to be themselves. You want my recommendation? Go home. No weapons, no elixirs. Go to the monster. Ask it who it is and what it wants. Accept that it is there, in your house. Find common ground with it, compromise with it, empathize with it. Some things you can't ignore or fight. Some things you have to talk to directly. Bertrand stood in silence for a moment, staring back at the man. He nodded and left. When Bertrand returned home, he went into the basement. He left his weapons outside. He kept himself sober. In the basement, as it always was, the hatch was closed. He approached it, breathed in deeply, and then reached down and ripped it open. Smoke and light shot out. The clouds and rays consumed him as he watched the vague outline of the monster appear. In front of him, it stood. Bertrand did not approach it, but he did not back away either. He stood his ground, close enough to see and communicate with it. The hazy outline morphed more and more into a defined human-like figure. Bertrand breathed in loudly through his nostrils. Then, in a shaky but bold voice, he said, "Would you like to come upstairs? We can talk there." There was a long pause. "Yes. Thank you," said the monster. Thank you so much for watching. This video is sponsored by AG1. With the winter months in full swing, our mental and physical health can easily become affected by this cold, dreary time of year. Focusing on our well-being is, of course, important all year long, but it's especially important during this time. Dealing with this issue is complex, but some of the foundational building blocks include things like managing stress and cognition and supporting your digestive health and immune system. Of course, managing these things is its own challenge, and that's what AG1 helps solve. AG1 is a daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health, including the brain, the gut, and the immune system. Through its science-driven formulation of micronutrients, phytonutrients, and essential symbiotics, it combines the value of multiple supplements into one simple, easy-to-commit to, and more effective method. When it comes to managing stress, sustaining energy, and keeping a balanced mood, AG1's adaptogens, vitamins, minerals, and other high-quality ingredients are designed to support these areas by helping raise your baseline health and supporting the gut and nervous system. Getting comprehensive nutrition is hard, and finding less stressful ways to manage things like stress and health is obviously better. AG1 has been so easy to commit to on a daily basis over a long term. It tastes great, and it quickly became a cornerstone of my daily routine, effortlessly catalyzing the day with good health and consistency. Go to drinkag1.com/pursuitofwonder to get your free welcome kit that includes the canister, shaker, a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2, and 5 extra travel packs of AG1. And of course, this video is sponsored by the book summary service, Blinkist. The first 100 people to use the link in the description will receive free unlimited access for 1 week, plus 25% off a full membership. Carl sat on his couch, looking back and forth between his phone and the ceiling, trying to figure out whether he was about to move 10,000 miles away to Australia, leaving his home, girlfriend, family, friends, job, and whole life behind, or not. The opportunity to move had suddenly come up when his best friend Novak decided he would be moving to Australia with his girlfriend. At age 27, Novak was facing a sort of quarter-life crisis and wanted to try and start something new and venture out into the world while he still felt new himself. Moving to Australia had been both Novak and Carl's dream ever since they were children and their families vacationed there. They both felt a weird natural connection with the colors, architecture, people, and feeling of the country. They visited again several times after throughout their teens and early 20s. On one of their trips, when they were 15, Carl and Novak agreed that they would move there when they were older. That and they would start a business together. This would remain their dream ever since. As they grew older though, like most dreams, it began to take a backseat to reality. Carl went to college for accounting in his hometown of Boston and got a job through a professor right after school that he couldn't turn down. Novak had a family member in a tech startup company in Boston, and as a result, he was given an opportunity to work for the company. However, after 4 years of Novak working for the company, it was suddenly acquired and he was out of a job. As part of the layoff, he was provided with a nice-sized severance package, and now, with some new extra money and nothing else stopping him, he decided he wanted to start a business and take a major leap of faith in his life. His girlfriend, somewhat of a free spirit, was on board with him. Novak came up with the idea of moving to Australia and creating an eco-friendly agri-tech company that utilized Australia's farming industry and its demand for local, farmed-fresh organic food. 1 month later, Novak told Carl that he and his girlfriend were moving to Australia within the next couple months. He told him about the business idea that he and his girlfriend worked on together and showed him the beta website and app he created. It looked and sounded great and well thought out. Novak's girlfriend had experience working in logistics, and Novak understood the business and technology side. They were the perfect duo. When Carl didn't fully understand, Novak explained to him that he wanted him to be a partner in the business and that he should move to Australia with them. He told Carl it would be perfect, and he could initially be in charge of sales, marketing, outreach, budgeting, and all the finances. He reminded Carl of their dream and told him how it would only get harder to move and try to create something like this. He sort of ridiculed the idea of Carl staying in Boston and working a corporate job for the rest of his life, as if that's what he really wanted. He told Carl how this business had a real chance to help people, how they could build a business model that would provide families with food who couldn't afford it and help the planet by contributing to a more sustainable food industry. Carl agreed with Novak's points, but told him that he needed a couple days to think about it, at least. Novak agreed and told him to let him know after he thought about it more. Over the next day, Carl thought about all the factors associated with the decision. He thought about how his mother had recently passed away just 2 years prior, and he and his father had become extremely close ever since. His father was not taking it well, and Carl's older brother had a strained relationship with his father, and so, in a way, Carl was all his father had left. He worried that if he left, it would break him. Carl also thought about his girlfriend Stephanie. They'd only been dating a little more than a year, but he had already started imagining a future with her. Things were going well, and they just seemed to click right. He knew that he couldn't expect her to go with him, and he knew a long-distance relationship was bound to fail, if she even agreed to it. He thought about all his other friends and family. He knew it wasn't as if they would cease to exist, but he also knew that in a way, their existence would fade a little. Perhaps so much so for some, that it would almost be as if they no longer existed at all. Then he thought about his current job. He worked for a great firm with great benefits, and he had finally started making some headway in the company. There was a lot of financial promise ahead of him, and he knew it was the more prudent career bet. But then, at the same time, he thought about how a greater risk meant a potentially greater reward. He didn't mind his current job, but it was fairly tedious and unexciting. He sort of just happened into it as a means of a conservative career path. He had always dreamed of being a part of building a business and creating a more meaningful impact and legacy for himself. Furthermore, he never particularly liked Boston. He had always wanted to move to the countryside ever since he was a kid. Specifically, he always envisioned a future where he lived in Australia. It was just one of those things that he had convinced himself of. And now, at 27, Carl felt an urge to leave home and forge his own life for himself while he was still young. He wondered how he could turn down such an opportunity to move to his dream location with his best friend and try to build something potentially important and helpful. How could he turn his back on his own vision of his future when it was right in front of him? For the following 3 days, Carl thought about the decision every waking second, ruminating back and forth between the potential outcomes of both choices. After 4 days, it seemed as if no matter how hard he tried, he made no progress in the decision. He remained equally unsure as to what he should do on the 4th day as the first. Both options seemed impossible to decipher. It wasn't an equation with numeric values or obvious reasoning. Each option was completely different, with their own entirely different set of variables and values, with no ability to know what any of it equated to. Carl had purposely held off sharing the situation with anyone else, so to avoid getting anyone upset before he had a better sense of what he was going to do himself. But by this point, he needed someone else's opinion. Over the next 2 days, Carl told his father, his girlfriend, 2 of his other close friends, and his aunt. He asked each of them what they thought he should do. Everyone gave him different answers. His dad and one of his friends said he should go. His aunt and his other friends said he should stay. His girlfriend didn't give him a straight answer, but her tears said everything Carl needed to know. They all had perfectly good, rational explanations for what they suggested, and yet Carl was no better off. He wondered how each answer could sound equally reasonable, but be completely contradictory. On the 6th night of indecision, Carl went on a walk around the city to try and clear his head. He walked late into the night, all around the city and along the harbor.
Heard this before
Eventually,
already.
he found himself on a bench facing
It's
the
really
water,
good, but
completely secluded in a sectioned-off corner of a pathway.
This.
He sat and he thought. He thought about how his entire future was hinged on this one decision contained inside his head. This video is sponsored by the data skills learning platform, DataCamp. Use the link in the description to try the first chapter of any course for free. Lawrence worked his whole life for this moment. He had experienced countless ups and downs, endured days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years of continuous self-doubt, hardship, sacrifice, uncertainty, and all the rest. But now, here he was, finally tasting the fruits of his labor as they squeezed out from the very core of his life. The day was August 12th, 2142. Lawrence had just received a standing ovation for a talk he gave at the world's most popular and respected biannual conference, at which the greatest thinkers, writers, leaders, and innovators of all sorts came both virtually or in person to give one of their life's greatest presentations, laying bare the accumulation of their mind on a stage scrutinized by the entire intellectual community and general public at large. The conference was streamed and distributed live across every virtual reality, augmented reality, and general streaming platform across the world. Following his flawless talk, both Lawrence and the audience knew what they had just experienced: a beautiful and successful encapsulation of a life's work that would likely impact the way people thought about human cognition, values, morality, and well-being forever. Lawrence had spent the majority of his adult life pursuing psychology, more specifically, theoretical neuropsychology. Throughout his life, he had this intense compulsion to understand, with total and complete objectivity, the nature and state of optimal well-being, or rather, what he would go on to term psychological worthiness, the most suitable, ideal, social, and personal conditions to provide the individual with the greatest subjective, qualitative conscious experience of their life. He had spent the vast majority of his 20s and 30s experimenting, researching, learning, and failing, developing a variety of insights and theories along the way. Up until more recently, now in his late 40s, his work had mostly gone unnoticed. But for some inexplicable reason, Lawrence always had this strange sense that he was on the right track, that somehow everything was supposed to work this way. He always felt a deep, genuine connection and enjoyment in his work, even when it would traditionally be considered rather miserable. He also always seemed to find himself falling into situations of great unforeseen luck just before hitting a wall or before things got too bad or unmanageable. And now, most importantly, he was being proven right, his work finally and actually clicking into place, bringing him right into that destination of limelight and giving him everything he ever wanted. In this moment of the conference, it felt like he had truly touched the ultimate state of life's worthiness, the very premise of his life's work. Throughout the remaining 3 nights of the conference following Lawrence's talk, he was approached by a large number of people, both general and virtual attendees, as well as other speakers. They asked him all sorts of questions. Many attempted to rub his shoulder well enough to become involved in his work or get him involved in theirs. Women of all sorts approached and hit on him, which he politely had to decline, pointing to his wife with him each time and revealing a flawlessly attractive woman who, by all physical standards, was in an entirely other league. He entertained everyone as much as necessary to remain polite, but mostly tried to get out of the majority of the interactions as quick as possible. One individual in particular, however, was extremely interesting to Lawrence. When he saw the man at the convention center bar one of the nights and recognized him as one of the first speakers of the conference, Lawrence actually hoped to get an opportunity to speak with him. The man was mysterious, with something noticeably distinct and almost separate about him. He fit the sort of super genius or science fiction hero archetype, or perhaps super villain, seemingly always dressed in all black with strange straight-down hair, an unusual amount of bionic body augmentations, and wearing all the latest technologies, almost like he was trying too hard to fit in, but was a few decades too early. This man had given a similarly impactful talk on a new, groundbreaking brain-computer technology 2 days prior to Lawrence's talk. Lawrence found it to be the most ambitious, interesting, and curious talk of the entire conference so far. The man was essentially proposing and announcing a soon-to-be publicly available technology which, if it did what he said, would basically be the type of innovation that defines and separates an entire period of history from all the prior. He had termed the technology New Life Technology and was the founder of the company being built around it. The company was set to basically offer people the option to opt out of their lives. After completely selecting, defining, and more or less programming the conditions of their desired experience of life, users would then step into cryogenic chambers, have electrodes implanted into their brain that would communicate brain signals, continuously stimulating neural patterns and perceptual states, and ultimately simulating an entirely new, different life for the remainder of the user's biological life. The machines would also nullify the user's previous memories in the process, replacing them with newly encoded false ones to match with their desired storylines, experiences, and conditions. Lastly, the user would be plugged into a separate program connected to a quantum supercomputer that created populations of artificially intelligent beings who could then be interacted with within the simulation in a manner that would be arguably equivalent to interacting with biological human minds. Previously, in its slightly earlier forms, the technology had been used exclusively for individuals with serious physical or mental ailments like body paralysis, comas, unresolvable depression, trauma, or worse. In these cases, it was considered by most to be ethically permissible, although, for many, even here, it was still certainly debatable. However, it was federally approved in most countries, which was enough. Now, however, this particular neuroscientist and technologist's premise was to allow ordinary, otherwise healthy people to use the technology. This was met by both worldwide support and worldwide contempt. The understandably large primary sticking point with the technology was that it essentially couldn't, at least not easily, be reversed or exited from, since once inside, the user wouldn't know that they were inside anything. And if it was set to be cut short, the effects of coming out could pose serious mental risks when trying to readjust back. As a result, currently, users would essentially be required to willingly and fully opt out of their own life until the end of their life. Part of what the man was giving a talk about was the risks compared to the benefits of such a choice, and how for some, if not many, it would still, for good reasons, actually be the preferable option. Lawrence found the entire premise of the man's talk to be somewhere between completely fascinating and completely nonsensical. In a lot of ways, it contradicted his own talk and key theories of well-being and human values. When the man approached Lawrence at the bar on the fourth night of the conference, Lawrence was excited to engage in a discussion with him. He had several questions, criticisms, and some hope that perhaps the seeds of a potential collaboration or debate could be planted for the future. The two congratulated each other first, then discussed each other's talks for a little while, then moved on to other, broader philosophical topics, and then finally narrowed back in on the New Life technology and its implications. They started fairly lighthearted, but as a few more beers were poured and emptied, the intensity increased. Lawrence argued not about the ethics of what the man was doing, but the philosophical problem with what it presumed, that consumers would and should desire to leave their life for a fake, virtual one, even if their own life was relatively bad and the new life could be anything they wanted. Lawrence argued that people want and should want to know and live in reality more than they want and should want to live in what is purely pleasurable, easy, desirable, and designed to one's preferences. We value the true form of things over the mere pleasure of what things can give us. The uncertainties and ups and downs of life are important, essential even. The negatives as much as the positives. In most cases, it's the difficulty, scariness, and unpleasantness a part of things that allows the experience of things to ultimately become meaningful or worthwhile, or perhaps even capable of being experienced at all, Lawrence said to the man. The man had plenty of counter-arguments, of course, suggesting that if one felt that life was best lived with ups and downs, they could just program that in. It need not be pure pleasure, Lawrence. I don't disagree with you on that point, but that doesn't discredit the technology. I'm not suggesting that people plug into a purely blissful experience of life if a purely blissful experience of life is not desirable, but I am suggesting plugging into a purely desirable life, the man replied. Yes, but people still want what is real. There are entirely separate factors relevant to human experience beyond the actual feeling of experiences. Humans want to earn their way to pleasure, to reward, to meaning. They want to be and do within truth, even if it's painful or hard. Perhaps even if it's only painful and hard with no reward. If it's simply engineered, chosen, or predetermined at the beginning, it's undesirable, and most won't do it. And they shouldn't, Lawrence went on with. Why not? The man asked with fairly sturdy confidence. Aren't you merely assuming the position that knowing truth will provide the most desirable experience of life, or greatest well-being, or whatever else you called it? I forget what term you used in your work. In any case, it isn't truth in and of itself that you're actually arguing for there, but the underlying desire for a preferred state that truth will give you. Worthiness. Lawrence quickly interjected to confirm his preferred terminology. Okay, worthiness. The man picked back up. Let's assume that if that term serves as an umbrella term for a life maximized to its highest degree of positive personal value, then it would not merely be a life defined by the most pleasure or least pain, nor the most truth or least illusion, but rather the most optimal experience of life in total, regardless. Sure, Lawrence interjected with hesitancy. Then would not the difference between life's maximal worthiness and life's minimal worthiness only be a matter of one's experience of it being so, or perhaps more accurately, the experience of their believing it to be? Yes, but Lawrence jumped in before quickly being cut back off. And if so, then any and all subset qualities that maximize this condition, this state, could all be set up to perfection within our machines, concluded the man. A little thrown off now, Lawrence replied, without even having to look any further into that argument, I would still say that you're missing the most important part. It isn't real. The people aren't real, the history and effects on the course of reality are not real, none of it's real, and that's fundamental. The man paused, nodded while smiling with clenched lips, and then asked Lawrence with a noticeable tinge of sarcasm, so then you don't want to do it? Lawrence let out a small laugh while smiling and rolling his eyes with a reciprocated note of sarcasm. We could really use you, the man added. I think a mind like yours could help us both inside and outside. Your ideas are really what's probably missing. I'm not supposed to share this, but we've already started short-term trials where people have gone in for short windows of time and come back out just fine. I'd love to see if there was maybe an opportunity there if you were ever interested. Look, I don't personally see anything ethically wrong with any of it, Lawrence interrupted. But I think you're wrong to assume, one, that people will want it, and two, that they should be convinced that they do. I like this life. It hasn't been easy, but it's real. So, no, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to pass. Okay, the man said with the final, accepting head nod. After a noticeably long pause of silence between the two, the man turned back to Lawrence and said, Then would you like to exit this one? Another shorter pause followed this. The bar? Lawrence replied with a short, confused laugh underneath his words. The man turned more straight on towards Lawrence and took off his augmented reality glasses. Then he said, Lawrence, you're going to have to try to bear with me here, but you are currently in a new life machine. The man paused again to let Lawrence process the information and reply. Lawrence did not successfully do either, but could only laugh, believing with certainty that the man was just joking or messing with him. I know this is hard, the man went on with. It always is. But this, right now, is actually an exit checkpoint inside a new life machine. You came up with the whole thing. One of the cleverest ones we've seen yet, I might add. You essentially came up with and scripted this entire conversation as a method of gauging your own interest in continuing or leaving without revealing to yourself that you're in anything prior to you declaring to a bot, myself, with sufficient certainty that you are no longer interested in the idea of being in here. And it seems to me that you just stated that. Another brief pause hung between them. You also planned on your own reasonable skepticism here, so... The man put his AR glasses back on and swiped his hand a couple times in relation to them. The entire bar, all the other people, objects, everything, turned pure white. Lawrence began to sink into the truth of what was happening, or rather, sort of not happening. If you tell me that you would prefer to leave this reality, which is in fact a simulation, and return to whom you were before in base reality, I can send an alert signal that will trigger a cease to the simulation right now. But I'm the only one who can do this, Lawrence, and this is the only checkpoint you currently have. You have a little time to think about it right now, but if you say no, I go away, and this memory is erased, and that's almost certainly the end of any way out. Lawrence, now petrified, began to noticeably and physically panic. The man grabbed Lawrence by both his shoulders and calmed him down. Once he was calmed down enough, Lawrence quickly asked, what was before? The man looked through a display of VR files only visible to him through his glasses. Then he said, before was similar in the overall fundamental sense. You were, well, sort of still are, an aspiring psychologist, especially interested in neuropsychology. But you are, beginning to get somewhat old, in your mid-hundreds now. You are still unsuccessful, at least in your view, and lacking the intellectual abilities to measure up to your dreams of becoming a leading thinker or theorist in this field. You were alone romantically and lower middle class. Again, that's all according to your own self-approved report. Lawrence looked down at his lap in indescribable shock. Then he looked back up. Why? He admitted. The man motioned a quick swipe of his hand again and then said, it was your dream to do what you did here at this conference. You wanted to be a leading thinker, an important, successful, revolutionary neuropsychologist. Yeah, a real one, Lawrence quickly interjected. The man paused and looked more directly at him. You are a real one. Another brief pause hung in the air while Lawrence tried to make sense of this ridiculous-seeming comment. Many years ago, you volunteered as an early trial member to help develop this technology. So far, you've helped reveal and map cognitive changes before, during, and after, and most importantly, provide real data and evidence on how to best set up psychological and neurological conditions. You're helping build a library of reliable experiences and states to be selected from for future users. Your findings in here are real. They have and will help people you know and don't know, remember and can't remember. And Lawrence, is there really any reason to believe that an experience is less valuable if it isn't real, if one cannot know the difference? Another very long pause sat between the two. So, the man said, would you like to stay or leave? This video was sponsored by DataCamp. With data science, data analytics, and data in general increasingly becoming a central function and material of the modern world, it is no secret that the demand and opportunity for individuals with creative and analytical data skills is extremely high. Whether you want to learn more basic, simple things like spreadsheets or data analysis with Excel,
It's already 7
or more
p.m. and I
advanced
need to
technical skills
fold my
related
clothes
to
and
becoming a
stuff.
data scientist with
So
R,
I have to stop
data
here.
scientist with Python, a data engineer,
Thanks for watching.